25 centuries ago, the Greek historian Herodotus, the man we still call the father of history, sat down to explain where a mysterious people in Italy had come from, and he told a story. There was a famine, he wrote, in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in Anatolia, the land we now call Turkey. It lasted 18 years, and at last the king divided his people in two and sent half of them away across the sea, under his own son, to find a new home. They sailed west, Herodotus said, until they reached Italy, and there they settled, and there they became a great and cultured people. He was writing about the Etruscans, the brilliant, enigmatic civilization that ruled central Italy before Rome, that taught the Romans their gods, their engineering, their gladiators, and the very shape of their alphabet. For 2,500 years, Herodotus's story stood as the answer. The Etruscans came from the east, from Anatolia, migrants across the water. It was written by the greatest historian of the ancient world. Who would argue with him? DNA would. And when scientists finally read the genomes of the Etruscans themselves, the result made no sense, because it flatly contradicted the one clue everyone thought was solid, and it left behind a mystery that is, if anything, deeper than the one Herodotus was trying to solve. Here's the thing about DNA. It doesn't defer to famous historians, no matter how ancient or how respected. It doesn't care that Herodotus wrote it down, or that Rome believed it, or that the story has been repeated for 100 generations. It only reports what's actually in the blood. So let's find out what the Etruscans were really made of, and why the answer broke a 2,500-year-old assumption. First, you have to understand why the Etruscans were such a tantalizing puzzle in the first place, because it comes down to one extraordinary fact: their language. The Etruscans spoke a tongue unlike anything around them. All their neighbors in Italy, the Latins, who became the Romans, and the other Italic peoples, spoke Indo-European languages, members of the vast family that includes Latin, Greek, Persian, Hindi, and eventually English. But Etruscan was not Indo-European. It was not related to Latin. It was not related to Greek. It was a language isolate, or close to it. A linguistic orphan sitting in the middle of Italy, surrounded by cousins who couldn't understand a word of it. We can actually read Etruscan writing, because they used a version of the Greek alphabet, so we can sound out their inscriptions. But the language underneath is alien, connected to almost nothing else on Earth. And that single strange fact is what launched 1,000 theories. A people with a totally foreign language, right in the heart of Italy. Surely they must have come from somewhere else. Surely they were migrants who carried that alien tongue in with them from a distant land. Surely Herodotus was right, and the answer was Anatolia. It's such a reasonable assumption. Language and ancestry feel like they should travel together. If a people speaks a language from far away, the obvious explanation is that the people came from far away. And so for centuries, the smart money was on the Eastern migration theory. The Etruscans were exotic. Their art had an Eastern flavor. Their language was foreign. And the father of history himself had told the migration story. The pieces seemed to fit. Then, in 2021, a large international team published a study in the journal Science Advances that did something no chronicle could do. They assembled ancient DNA from Etruscan individuals and traced the genetics of central Italy across nearly 2,000 years, a genetic time-transect running from the Iron Age, through the height of Etruscan civilization, into the Roman era and beyond. They took the actual bodies of the Etruscans and asked them, directly, in the language of the genome, "Where are you from?" And the Etruscans answered in a way that stunned everyone who had bet on Herodotus. They were local. They were from Italy. Their DNA showed no sign of a recent migration from Anatolia or the Eastern Mediterranean. Instead, the Etruscans were genetically almost indistinguishable from their neighbors, the Latins, the very Italic peoples whose languages were completely different from Etruscan. They shared the same ancestral makeup, a deep European farmer foundation mixed with a large dose of the steppe-derived ancestry that had spread across Europe in the Bronze Age, the same ancestry that had come with the Indo-European languages. In their genes, the Etruscans looked like exactly what you'd expect of a long-settled population of central Italy. They were not visitors from the East. They were natives of the soil Rome would later rule. And there it is, the result that makes no sense, because now the pieces don't fit at all. Here is a people who were genetically local, ancestrally identical to their Indo-European-speaking neighbors, carrying the very same steppe ancestry that everywhere else in Europe came bundled together with Indo-European languages. And yet they spoke a non-Indo-European language, an alien tongue with no relatives. The genes said, "We are from here, we are like our neighbors." The language said, "We are unlike anyone around us." Both were true, and they should not both be true. That's the paradox the DNA created. It solved the origin question and deepened the language mystery in the very same stroke. Think carefully about what this means, because it's genuinely strange. Everywhere else, the great rule of European prehistory was that the steppe migrations brought both new ancestry and new Indo-European languages together as a package. The horsemen came, and they brought their genes and their tongues at the same time. But in Etruria, something broke that rule. The people received the steppe ancestry. It's right there in their DNA. But they did not end up speaking an Indo-European language. Somehow, they held on to a different language, an older one that seems to have survived from before the Indo-European wave washed across the continent. The Etruscan language may be a genuine relic, a last surviving echo of the tongues that were spoken in Europe before the steppe migrations, preserved on Italian soil while it was replaced everywhere else. The people mixed and changed, absorbing new ancestry like everyone else. But the language, against all odds, stayed old. If a 2,500-year-old mystery reopening in real time is the kind of thing that thrills you, then subscribe. Not for the algorithm. Because history is full of these moments where the DNA answers one question and detonates another, and there's a lot more of it here. You'll want to be around when the next chronicle gets tested against the bones. So what actually happened? How do you get a genetically local, steppe-carrying population speaking a pre-Indo-European language in the middle of Iron Age Italy? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, and that's the beautiful part. But the leading picture goes something like this. Language and ancestry are not chained together. They can move independently. A language can be passed down, clung to, preserved by a community across thousands of years, even as that community mixes genetically with its neighbors, even as new ancestry flows in. The Etruscans, it seems, were a population that participated fully in the genetic history of Italy, receiving the same farmer and steppe ancestry as everyone else, while culturally and linguistically holding on to something much older, a language that predated the Indo-European arrival and simply refused to die out in that one corner of the peninsula. They were, in a sense, genetically new and linguistically ancient at the same time. Herodotus saw the strange old language and assumed it meant the people were foreign. He got it exactly backwards. The people were local. It was only the language that was a visitor from deep time. The study didn't stop at the Etruscan heyday either, and the rest of the time-transect tells its own dramatic story. As the centuries rolled on and Etruria was absorbed into the Roman world, the DNA of the region changed sharply. During the Roman imperial period, a large influx of Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern ancestry appeared in central Italy, the genetic fingerprint of the empire itself, of a cosmopolitan Mediterranean world where people, enslaved and free, moved and mixed across vast distances, all roads leading to Rome. So the irony is almost poetic. The Eastern ancestry that Herodotus imagined arriving with the Etruscans at the very beginning did eventually arrive in Italy, but centuries later, and for completely different reasons, brought by the churning human tide of the Roman Empire, long after the Etruscans themselves had been absorbed. The migration Herodotus described happened, sort of, just not to the people he thought, and not at the time he thought. Deep time has a dark sense of humor. Let's be fair to Herodotus for a moment, though, because it's easy to mock the ancients with a genome sequencer in your hand. He was doing something genuinely remarkable for his era, trying to explain the origins of a foreign people through evidence and reasoning rather than pure myth. He simply had only one real clue to work with, that strange, alien language, and he drew the most reasonable conclusion available to anyone before the science of genetics existed. Foreign language, foreign people. It's the same intuitive mistake people have made about population after population, right up to the present day. Language feels like it should be a passport stamped with your ancestry. And over, the DNA has shown that it isn't. The Etruscans are simply one of the most dramatic examples. A people whose language pointed one direction, and whose blood pointed another, and who kept that contradiction alive for 1,000 years. So where does that leave us? The origin question. Did the Etruscans come from Anatolia? Is answered. No. They were an indigenous people of Italy, genetically kin to the Romans-to-be, carriers of the same deep European ancestry as their neighbors. Herodotus's migration story, 25 centuries old, is finally laid to rest by the Etruscans' own DNA. But the language question, where did that alien orphan tongue actually come from? And how did it survive the Indo-European flood that drowned every other pre-Indo-European language in the region? That question is now wide open, and arguably more fascinating than ever. The genome closed one door and blew another one off its hinges. That is exactly what the best science does. It doesn't just hand you answers, it hands you better mysteries. And there's something almost moving in the final picture. A people, genetically ordinary for their time and place, who nonetheless carried, on their tongues, a fragment of a lost world, a language older than the Great Migrations, a survivor from before, kept alive for generation after generation in the heart of Italy until Rome finally absorbed both the people and their words. When the last person who could speak Etruscan died, a thread reaching back to the deep pre-Indo-European past of Europe was cut forever. The bodies told us they were from here. The language told us it was from a time we can barely see. Both were telling the truth. That's the thing about DNA. It will happily correct the father of history himself. It will tell you, without hesitation, that a famous ancient story was wrong. But it is honest enough to admit when it has only deepened the mystery instead of ending it, and generous enough to leave the best question of all still standing, waiting for someone else to solve. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.